The sky over Rome reverberated with thunder like the voice of an angry god. Yet it could not drown out the agonized wails echoing from behind the imperial palace's inner sanctum. Senator Lucius Marcus trembled as he held the torch, its flickering light dancing across the cold marble walls. Two guards at his side whispered, "Hold the torch steady. Sire, His Majesty requires illumination." These words signalled neither a solemn ritual nor a sumptuous banquet, but a crime concealed behind the mantle of power, where innocence was shattered under the guise of imperial privilege. Silence enveloped the surroundings, broken only by the torch's glow, and Lucius's ragged breathing echoing down the shadow-filled corridor. Every time a lightning bolt pierced the small window, the storm deepened the gloom, as if all of Rome held its breath, trailing the senator's every step toward that ominous door. That heavy iron door hid an unimaginable scene. A girl under 14 years old was no longer a daughter or a child, but merely a serial number recorded in the Empire's ledger of pleasures. Each page, each numeral, each line chronicled the process of stripping away her humanity, reducing her to a resource for lust. One could picture her with glossy hair and clear eyes, now lying motionless under the torch's dim glow, like a lifeless object, an image that twisted the hearts of onlookers in anguish. Those fathers, once commanding legions and delivering impassioned speeches in the forum, now stood silent in ceremonial armor, torches in hand, illuminating their daughter's degradation. Their once proud honor, cracked like marble walls under the weight of atrocity, lay in ruins beneath the burden of evil. Rome, the empire that had once subdued countless lands, now turned inward to tear its own families apart, instilling a terror beyond words. This was no legend or rumor, but a brutal reality. The cobblestone streets that once resounded with the wheels of war chariots now bore only the shuffling footsteps of tormented souls. Echoing in Lucius's mind were the whispered warnings of predecessors. Do not resist, or your entire lineage will be lost. That whisper haunted him as the iron door creaked open, revealing flickering light and dreadful moans. Rome, once a symbol of law and order, had transformed those very principles into a ruthless code that forced all to bow their heads. Since Caligula, the hopeful candidate for the dynasty, ascended the throne, ambitions of power and sinful desires had seeped from early promises of peace and justice into the dim corridors where tragedy unfolded. At first, the populace brimmed with faith when hearing decrees of tax relief for the poor and witnessing the release of exiles from prison. People believed the new reign would be different. Yet few noticed the secret councils of loyalists where dark mandates were issued. Gradually, the imperial palace became a factory of suffering, recording each harvest operation of human beings. There was no blood spilled on battlefields, only tears, screams, and the humiliation of souls catalogued with data, reports, and signatures. The curtain of power fell away to reveal a spectral light at the intersection of authority and atrocity, sowing pain into every noble household. Once proud families were compelled into silence, torches in hand, forced to illuminate the horrors within. The weight of their silence was more dreadful than any cry. When the final veil of the imperial court closed, Rome ceased to be a city of justice and became a city of smouldering fear, where supreme power trumped every human value. In those dark days, even as 100,000 storms battered the sky, the cries would forever echo in the minds of witnesses, a reminder of a time when an emperor claimed the right to strip humanity of its very essence. When news of Tiberius's passing spread through the marble halls in the spring of 37 AD, Rome seemed to draw a collective, long overdue sigh of relief. The city, weighed down for 23 years by the heavy cloak of his suspicion and occasional cruelty, felt as though it were waking from a fevered sleep. Citizens who had forgotten what it was like to breathe freely and smile again whispered in the streets of renewal. The Senate, wearied by endless trials where whispered rumors could mean sudden execution, dared to hope once more. Even the Praetorian Guard, those formidable protectors now accustomed to guarding against perceived threats within, looked skyward in quiet anticipation of a brighter dawn. That dawn arrived in the figure of Gaius, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus, affectionately known by soldiers and commoners alike as Caligula Little Boots, a nickname earned during his childhood, trudging through muddy camps at his father Germanicus's side. Tales of his early years carried the scent of leather tents and the clang of swords rather than the stale stillness of palace corridors. To Rome's populace, he was no mere heir by bloodline, but a living promise of regained dignity, a bridge between the grandeur of Augustus and the warm-hearted compassion of a new beginning. From his very first steps beneath the Arch of Triumph, Caligula brought a burst of youthful energy that felt almost intoxicating. He moved among the cheering crowds, with the ease of a man untouched by paranoia. Bonuses flowed lavishly to the legions, whose battle-scarred veterans had grown accustomed to rumblings of mistrust. Taxes were eased for those who toiled in the city's narrow lanes. Their burdens lightened at last, and the Colosseum roared back to life with grand spectacles that painted its sands in the vivid hues of camaraderie and shared celebration. Senators, many with tears glistening in their eyes, rose to applaud his speeches, words promising justice, generosity, and a return to a gentler form of rule. Sacrifices were offered at every altar, and prayers for his reign filled the temples, as citizens murmured in bustling marketplaces. At last, Rome has found its smile again. Yet beneath that radiant mask of benevolence, a subtler tempest began to gather force. The first fractures in this new idol were barely perceptible whispers drifting through the servants' quarters of the palace, stifled by the grandeur of birchwood banquets and the glare of torchlight. A kitchen maid vanished without explanation, her duties left undone, her apron still hanging by the hearth. The official word was that she had fled in fear of punishment. But darker rumours hinted at a more sinister fate. Her body, once found drifting in the Tiber, bore wounds so dreadful that even the palace guards were loath to speak of them. Not long after, 2 more souls disappeared from the emperor's domain, a 15-year-old boy and a 17-year-old girl, both of whom served in minor capacities. Their absences, too, went unexplained at first. Then, as though the night itself conspired to disclose what ought to remain hidden, both bodies surfaced along the riverbank. Their expressions, frozen in horror, spoke of unutterable agony, and still, the court remained shrouded in silence. Caligula continued to present himself before the people with an easy smile, as if nothing had shifted in the golden tapestry of his rule. Rome's greatest misstep lay in its willingness to embrace youthful power without heed to these early omens. The applause and tear-streaked faces in the Senate camouflaged a dangerous naivete. No one paused to question why those first murmurings of violence were met with official explanations so thin as to be transparent. The people chalked up the vanished servants to the occasional cruelty of imperial justice, believing that any monarch must, at times, test the bounds of his authority. In their eagerness to bask in Caligula's promised renewal, they dismissed the shadows growing at the edges of his reign, and so Rome hurtled forward, blind to the gathering storm. The city that once prided itself on the rule of law and the sanctity of family was already bearing the first scars of betrayal. As the corridors of the palace darkened with secrets too terrible to name, the citizens below continued to rejoice, lulled by the illusion of prosperity. In their blind trust, they allowed the seeds of tragedy to take root, unaware that each cheer and each tear of gratitude paved the way for a horror that would one day consume them all. Amid the swell of renewed hope, Caligula captured the hearts of the Roman populace with a series of sweeping measures that felt like a balm on wounds 23 years in the making. He bestowed generously upon the legions, granting them sizable bonuses that alleviated the burdens carried on battle-scarred shoulders. Then, like a gentle breeze dispersing the shadows of the Tiber River, he reduced the onerous taxes that had crushed the common folk for so long. Markets buzzed with gratitude as merchants traded with newfound freedom, and artisans toiled without fear of confiscation. Evenings at the Colosseum transformed into grand spectacles, chariot races, whose wheels caught the torchlight in a merry dance. Gladiatorial contests that echoed with the roars of appreciative crowds, and elaborate pageants that painted the sands in vivid hues. Such generosity seemed to promise a new era of benevolence, one that would marry the valor of Rome's past with a kindness long absent from public life. Senators, once tense and uneasy under Tiberius's watchful eye, found their rigid composure softening. In the Curia Julia, long faces cracked into tentative smiles as Caligula addressed them with a youthful warmth. He listened to their petitions with visible attentiveness, and when decrees were passed in his favor, he clapped with genuine enthusiasm, as though each law represented a step toward collective well-being rather than personal gain. Throughout the forum, word of his benefactions spread like wildfire, carried by merchants' loud calls and mothers' hopeful murmurs. At last, the empire breathes again, was the refrain, whispered in taverns and sung softly at hearths, even beyond the walls. In the dusty villages that dotted the Italian countryside, travellers brought back tales of a ruler unshackled from paranoia, eager to heal ancient wounds. Yet beneath that radiant surface lay a kernel of darkness slowly fermenting behind closed doors. In the labyrinthine corridors of the Palatine, the first hints of atrocity took shape. A kitchen maid vanished without warning or explanation, her tasks abandoned on the cold stone floor. Court officials offered a perfunctory statement she had fled in dread of punishment, but rumour insisted otherwise, that her lifeless body drifted along the Tiber's gentle currents, bearing wounds too ghastly to name. The common folk, though uneasy, swallowed this story, comforted by the belief that such horrors were anomalies, the unfortunate price of new authority finding its footing. Not long after, 2 young slaves, one a boy of 15 summers, the other a girl of 17, similarly disappeared from view. Their absence went unremarked by the palace at first. Then, as though compelled by some cruel design, their bodies surfaced near the riverbank. Villagers recoiled at the sight, faces twisted in permanent agony, flesh marred by violence. Yet still the imperial court maintained silence. Caligula, unperturbed, continued to parade before the masses with a serene smile, as if the fates themselves had decreed that his beneficence need never waver. Within the marble chambers of governance, many senators dismissed these grim events as the unfortunate side effects of youthful reign. He is but in his youth, they murmured to one another, comforted by the notion that time and maturity would temper any excesses. They recalled their own younger days, the passions that once flared before reason prevailed. Give him but a few seasons, they reasoned, and he will reach the level of venerable wisdom. Thus they clothed their doubts in hope, even as their hearts fluttered with faint unease. Meanwhile, Caligula's power swelled beyond the bounds of mere governance. Those whose loyalty he deemed unquestioning found themselves elevated, while anyone harbouring a flicker of reluctance quietly faded from view. In secret councils, far from public scrutiny, he began to sift through his Praetorian Guard, discarding those bound by oath alone, replacing them with men whose devotion was cemented by shared complicity in darker deeds. These new sentinels required no scruples of conscience, only absolute compliance. They learned, swiftly and without hesitation, that their passage to privilege lay in their willingness to serve whatever command they received, no matter how dreadful. Thus, the tragedy of Rome's Renaissance unfolded in hidden acts, cloaked by the intoxicating joys of new largesse. Caligula used the early triumphs of his rule as a mask, shrouding the horrors growing in the wings. While citizens revelled in the sudden relief of taxes lowered and games revived, the machinery of cruelty hummed quietly in the background. Whispers of vanished servants and mutilated bodies circulated in the markets, Yet no voice dared rise above cautious tones. In public, people drank, laughed, and praised the king who seemed, by all outward measures, the herald of a golden age. Gradually, that darkness spread, seeping into every corner of the empire. Families once bound by the sanctity of home found their trust undermined by vague fear. Servants slept uneasily, glancing toward closed doors. Guards, emboldened by their newly acquired power, rumbled through hallways in the dead of night. And still, the grand spectacles continued, feasts glowing by torchlight, parades through the heart of the city, gifts heaped upon the suffering populace. In this way, Caligula's reign wrapped itself in a duality: open generosity, gilding the gates, secret brutality, festering within. Sleep descended over Rome like a velvet curtain, each household drifting into slumber under the illusion of peace. Yet in the hearths of many hearts, a seed of dread had been planted. By the time dawn broke anew, the city would stir once more to the clang of trumpets, the roar of the amphitheatre, and the silent drumbeat of something far more sinister pulsing just beneath the surface. In October of 37 AD, 6 months into his reign, Caligula was struck by a sudden and violent illness. He lay delirious in his imperial chamber, his fever soaring to heights that seemed to sear his very soul. And for days he teetered on the brink between life and death. Word of the emperor's condition spread through the city like a rushing tide, from the grand gates of the Palatine Hill to the narrow lanes where the poor eked out their existence. Temples that had fallen silent for years erupted once more with the clang of sacrificial bells. Horses were led to the altars, their hooves shuffling in the dust as priests poured wine and oil in trembling supplication. Citizens, their voices quivering with fear, strewn branches of evergreen and lit candles at every shrine, praying in hushed tones to Mars, to Jupiter, to any deity who might spare their newly beloved ruler. Even the most cynical soothsayers and jesters, accustomed to mocking the whims of the gods, fell into an uneasy silence. Their usual jests were stilled by the dread that gripped every corner of Rome. For in Caligula, the people had placed their fragile hopes of relief from decades of paranoia and treachery, and now they clung to the notion that his survival might itself be a miracle. When at last the emperor emerged from his fever, pale but breathing, Rome stirred from its collective vigil with a burst of jubilation. Trumpets blared in the forum, families gathered for feasts of thanksgiving, and the Senate issued proclamations hailing the event as a divine miracle. Yet those closest to him whispered that the man who rose from his sickbed was no longer the same. They spoke in fearful tones of a transformation wrought by his ordeal, of a mind relinquishing its mortal confines in exchange for a terrifying conviction of his own invincibility. It was as though the fever had burned away his empathy, leaving in its place a cold certainty that he had gazed into death and returned beyond its reach. Moral restraint, once a consideration even for emperors, became for him an antiquated concept, as though it belonged to another era entirely. Within days of his recovery, the hidden longings that had simmered beneath the surface burst into the open. The Praetorian Guard, once composed of men whose loyalty sprang from solemn oaths and military honor, was quietly purged and replenished with soldiers chosen for their capacity to obey without question. These new guardians required no reminders of their duties. They found their allegiance in the clandestine rewards offered by a ruler who no longer recognized the boundaries of decency. Caligula's summons became a whisper that silenced all other commands. Invitations to private banquets were delivered by lacquered messengers to the senators and their wives, each note sealed with the imperial signet. To decline such an invitation was to flirt with doom. Refusal threatened the swift removal of one's privileges, and sometimes far more. Soon, whisperings in the corridors told of noble women who entered the palace, expecting gracious hospitality, only to find themselves at the mercy of an emperor whose appetite knew no limits of age or status. In parallel, young men of the senatorial class found themselves granted the honor of service within the imperial household, a distinction that quickly revealed its true nature. These youths, drawn by the promise of favor and glory, were met instead with the humiliating ministrations of palace attendants. They were painted with rouge, draped in silken garments meant to accentuate vulnerability, and forced into roles that stripped them of any semblance of their former pride. Each act of submission was recorded in the dark ledgers maintained by Helon, a freedman whom Caligula elevated to the singular and grisly role of master of pleasures. Helon's office was unlike any other in the empire. In his hands, the catalogue of human bodies became a ledger of appetites. He was charged with procuring, arranging, and documenting every instance of the emperor's demands. No matter how depraved, noble daughters and merchant sons, once shielded by the prestige of their birth, were reduced to entries in Helon's meticulous lists. Each line contained the name of a newcomer to the imperial service, accompanied by age, status, and, chillingly, a notation of compliance rating. When the rating fell short, it was whispered that further instruction was administered, though by what means remained the subject of fearful conjecture. Thus did the palace itself become the grand stage of Caligula's emerging tyranny. The great halls and glittering chambers, which had once witnessed the pomp of dawn audiences and the solemn debates of the Senate, now echoed with the whispered cries of those dragged into the emperor's private intrigues. Torches burned low, casting long shadows that danced on the frescoed walls, as if the very art had been corrupted by the scenes unfolding beneath it. In the stillness of the night, servants heard the rustle of silk and the soft sobs of unwilling participants, their dignity stripped away under the pretext of royal mandate. And so the public face of Caligula's reign, that of a generous benefactor and rejuvenator of Roman grandeur, stood in stark and gruesome contrast to the horrors being quietly institutionalized behind palace gates. Each decree of bounty, each lowered tax, rang out across the city as proof of his seeming compassion. Yet with every public act of munificence, the machinery of degradation ground deeper into the lives of Rome's elites. While the citizens revelled in revived games and festivals, the emperor's personal ledger continued to swell, a testament to a regime in which human flesh was accounted for as readily as grain, and where the ledger lines shone as coldly as any gold coin. Night after night, Rome fell into a slumber tinged with unease. The distant hum of celebrations mingled with the suppressed dread that seeped from the Palatine Hill. For in the hush of their dreams, many imagined the ledger's ink staining the columned halls, felt the chill of torches held by trembling hands, and heard, faint as a waking nightmare, the muffled sobs of those who dared not speak. And as the candles guttered and the city dozed, a single, chilling thought drifted through the collective unconscious. The true cost of Caligula's gifts was only just beginning to be counted. Thus October's vigil yielded not peace, but a new understanding of terror. Rome's golden dawn had turned, quietly and irrevocably, into a nightmarish dominion, and beneath the veneer of festivals and feasts lay the dark calculus of a ruler who, convinced of his own immortality, cared nothing for the lives he extinguished in pursuit of unending ecstasy. After his recovery, Caligula no longer perceived himself as a mere mortal. He elevated his private ambitions into imperial decrees, transforming his personal desires into official palace policy. In the grand ledgers of the imperial archives, no longer were there entries for grain shipments or tax revenues. Instead, each volume catalogued the empire's most precious, yet most vulnerable assets: the daughters of senators, the wives of nobles, the sons of merchants. Every individual was assigned a code name, their age and beauty meticulously noted, as though they were exotic commodities destined for the emperor's pleasure. This bureaucratic repurposing of human life underlined a chilling new reality that desire, once hidden behind closed doors, was now enshrined as state practice. With the assistance of Helon, the freedman elevated to the singular role of master of pleasures. The emperor undertook a quiet purge of the palace guard. Where once loyalty and honor had bound these soldiers, now only their capacity for cruelty and obedience mattered. New recruits were tested for callousness rather than courage, groomed in secret chambers to perform the most depraved of rituals. Instructors, appointed by Caligula himself, guided them through mock ceremonies in which victims were objectified and suffering became spectacle. Thus, the palace evolved into a living warehouse, where human beings were processed with the efficiency of factory machinery, their pain catalogued and archived for future exploitation. Every hall and hidden alcove was altered to amplify terror rather than beauty. Palace architects were ordered to design chambers whose acoustics carried the softest moan to the farthest vantage point, ensuring that both victims and unwilling witnesses would share a common dread. Along the corridors, wrought iron torch stands were fitted at precise heights, tall enough to light the scene of agony, yet low enough that senators, standing rigid and silent, could not avert their gaze. A single misstep, a whispered plea, or a stifled sob invited immediate reprisal. The name of the girl or woman connected to the faltering guard would be inscribed in the so-called pleasure ledger under the category processing item, marking her for the next round of ritual. This ledger system, maintained by a coterie of desk clerks, secretaries, and chancellors, recorded each day's entries with grim precision. Every hour, each victim's name, condition, and location was documented, just as meticulously as any imperial financial transaction. Procedures were formalized in a manner akin to entries in the state treasury instructions. Dimestumps, statutory remarks all bound in leather volumes, stamped with the imperial seal. Those who remained outside these ceremonies of horror were deemed non-existent, whether through silent compliance or fearful obedience. Their names, too, they were logged, ensuring that no soul could truly escape the emperor's oversight or the ledger's authority. Rome itself, once the proud heart of civilization, quietly metamorphosed into a silent slave market under the hand of a single man. Where gleaming forums had once echoed with debates on justice and virtue, now haggling whispers circulated about new arrivals to Caligula's grim inventory. Noble families, once secure in their lineage and honor, found themselves reduced to entries on parchment priceless, only until the next voluntary or coerced performance of allegiance. The palace darkness, formerly a private domain of courtly intrigue, was methodically transformed into an institution of cruelty, its corridors humming with the soft rustle of perfumed silk and the harder rasp of leather shackles. In the end, the great achievement of Caligula's reign was not the expansion of territory or the forging of alliances, but the systematization of humanity itself. The ledgers that recorded each young woman's name, each nobleman's silent complicity, became the enduring relics of this reign of terror. These bound pages, inked in secrecy, sealed with fear, stand as the empire's darkest testament, capturing in cold, precise detail the tragedy of those who walked the fine line between privilege and peril. And so, in the hushed aftermath of candlelight and torch glow, Rome's legacy was rewritten not as a beacon of law and order, but as a market of souls, where every heart's quiet plea resonated in the empty spaces between each blackened ledger entry. After a period of concealment, Caligula began to openly establish his vile apparatus, as one might unfold a cruel tapestry for all to see. The Praetorian Guard, once a bastion of martial honor, was quietly purged and remade. Soldiers renowned for their loyalty and courage found themselves replaced by men chosen for a very different virtue, unflinching obedience to cruelty. These new guards were not trained to defend the emperor's person, but rather to enact the darkest of rituals, sharing in his inhuman pleasures as willing accomplices. Their training took place behind closed doors, in chambers where torches burned low, and whispered instructions guided them through the grotesque choreography that Caligula demanded. No longer simply protectors, They became instruments of terror. Their drilled precision, ensuring that every command, no matter how abhorrent, would be carried out without hesitation. In the heart of the palace archives emerged a new volume, grim and portentous, the Pleasure Ledger. Contrary to the fat tomes of grain tallies or tax receipts that once filled the shelves, this slender, black-bound book chronicled human lives as if they were mere cargo. Each page listed a target: the senator's daughter, the general's younger sister, the merchant's son, and so forth. Each entry bore a coded name, the subject's age, a note on their appearance, and suggestions for utilitarian deployment. Even appraising a commercial value, were they to be auctioned in secret. The language was clinical, inked in jet-black strokes that rendered the horror impersonal, as though reporting on livestock rather than flesh and blood. Such a ledger, meticulously maintained, transformed private vice into a bureaucratic function. But Caligula did not stop at mere record-keeping. He elevated fear itself into ritual. Along the marble corridors, where once tapestries and frescoes had celebrated Rome's triumphs, now stood rows of precisely positioned torch stands. Architects were instructed to place them at exact heights so that the flame would strike directly upon the victim, illuminating every gasp and tremor. Fathers, once proud commanders of legions, were summoned to hold these torches as silent sentinels to the horrors within. 1 inch of misplacement, one flicker of doubt, and the ledger would claim another name oftener than not, that of the torchbearer's own daughter or wife. It was a cruel calculus to obey, was to survive. To falter was to condemn an entire household. All the while, the designers of the palace optimized acoustics to amplify the slightest whimper. Stone walls and vaulted ceilings were shaped to carry the faintest cry to hidden alcoves, ensuring that senators, awaiting their turn, might hear the pitiful pleas of those before them. In the lulls between thunderclaps, the echoing moans slipped through grated windows and under door cracks, haunting the dreams of the watchers. In their chambers, lords and ladies bore witness to the suffering they had been compelled to illuminate. Acutely aware that silence offered no solace, to speak would mean immediate reprisal, and to remain silent was to allow the tragedy to continue. Behind the scenes, a legion of clerks, secretaries, and scribes maintained the dark ledger with obsessive precision. Each day, each hour, each victim's name and location was entered with the same rote accuracy that Rome's treasury once used to track coin. The official code of this hidden domain was simple and merciless compliance, ensured one's continued existence, while defiance spelled death. These records, bound and sealed, served as proof not only of the victims' identities, but also of the watchers' complicity. The ledger became the ultimate weapon of control, a manifest of fear and submission, as rumors of the ledger and its cold entries drifted beyond palace walls. The markets and taverns buzzed with wary whispers. Yet, no one dared to raise an open protest, for those who tried to speak against the unspeakable were said to vanish without trace. Their names added to the ledger in a still more ominous category, processed item. The populace learned, in hushed tones, that discretion was not only prudent, but necessary for survival. The city, lulled by the routine of daily life, soon accepted the ledger's existence as another facet of imperial order, no less official than the decrees on coinage or providence. Thus did Rome's Grand Palace become a stage for systematic atrocity, where human bodies were catalogued, orchestrated, and displayed according to the emperor's every whim. The splendor of the colonnades and the gleam of the marble could not mask the sinister purpose they now served. In the hushed hush of night, with torches flickering and pages turning in the pleasure ledger, the city's elite realized, perhaps too late, that the machinery of Rome had been repurposed. No longer did it uphold law and civic virtue. Instead, it churned out sorrow and compliance in a factory of human misery. And so, As the empire slumbered under the same moonlit sky that had once heralded campaigns of conquest, a new order reigned behind palace gates, one measured not by the weight of gold or the yield of grain, but by the tally of broken souls. The pleasure ledger, bound in darkness, stood as its chronicle, an archive of terror that ensured every whispered secret, every stifled sob, and every trembling hand would forever be accounted for in the annals of Caligula's reign. Rome's imperial palace, once the illustrious heart of civilized power, had quietly transformed into a vast factory of sorrow. When Caligula determined that human resources needed systematic development on a grand scale, he unleashed a campaign he called the National Resource Assessment. No noble household was spared its scrutiny. Officials surveyed aristocratic estates for wealth, reputation, and most chillingly, reproductive potential. Any child of a certain age, those who had not yet reached full maturity, was dutifully recorded and ranked, as though each lineage were a field ready for harvest. Deputies to this grim endeavour formed what became known as the Breeding Control Board, composed of physicians, apothecaries, scribes, and even consecrated priests. They travelled from villa to villa, measuring hip breadth, noting previous births, and classifying each young woman by her fertility rating, an assessment akin to agricultural grading. Pregnancy and childbirth were managed like industrial processes. Strict diets were prescribed, physical activity regulated, and unfortunate miscarriages were sometimes deemed production errors, punishable by fines or worse. Every stage from conception to lactation was outlined in protocol sheets, signed and sealed with the imperial cipher. In tandem, Caligula inaugurated a program he termed the Royal Stock Breeding Initiative. Pairs of noble youth were assigned not by affection or family alliances, but by genetic compatibility metrics, a fair-haired lady matched with a brawny gladiator, or a noble woman of exotic descent paired with a veteran of distant provinces, all intended to yield the most desirable progeny. Offspring from these unions were not raised at home. They were immediately transferred to the palace's training academy, where specialist departments sorted them into categories such as future legionnaire, palace handmaiden, or production slave. The aim was efficiency to mould new generations according to the precise specifications of imperial demand. Each step of this grim assembly line was recorded with meticulous care: the date of union, the projected due date, the outcome of the birth, and the child's subsequent fate. Families whose contributions helped swell the human stock of the empire received commendations and tokens of favour, while those who refused or underperformed faced social demotion under the classification non-viable resource. This reward and punishment system was fine-tuned to ensure a constant flow of fresh recruits into Caligula's machinery, leaving no gap in the supply chain of suffering. Moreover, in a particularly insidious expansion, Caligula extended the program to his male heirs. Prominent boys of noble blood were conscripted into the male re-education scheme, forced to abandon their given names in favour of floral noms de guerre flora. Lily, Rose, each accompanied by a notation of smooth countenance. Once rechristened, they underwent daily rituals of makeup application, feminine garb fitting, and instruction in demure gesturas, high-pitched speech patterns, and courtly demeanours reminiscent of temple priestesses. This transformation aimed not only to satisfy the emperor's predilections, but also to undermine the patriarchal pride of Rome's leading families. Fathers were compelled to watch their sons paraded in robes and ribbons, undone by the very lineage they had once hailed. While knowing that resistance would invite ruin, yet none of this spectacle diminished the programme's bureaucratic precision. Cabinets of ebony and ivory held countless scrolls, each a ledger of union schedules, pregnancy records, and performance evaluations. Caligula's scribes treated human life as though it were as negotiable as grain or silk. Entries were stamped with imperial seals, annotated with marginalia on user satisfaction, and archived in vast repositories that defied both reason and decency. These archives became the empire's grim testament, pages upon pages, attesting to the systematic commodification of flesh and blood. In the streets and taverns far below the palace's marble parapets, rumours of these monstrous policies circulated in hushed tones. Mothers feared for their daughters. Husbands looked upon their wives with newfound dread. And children sensed the pervasive unease in the very air they breathed. Yet few dared to speak openly, for every whisper of dissent carried the threat of being tagged in a ledger as uncooperative, an entry that might consign one's family to social exile, or worse, to the palace's own processing chambers. Thus, with each passing season, the empire folded private life into its machinery of exploitation, the silent procession of carriages bearing young women to the palace, the midnight summons to fathers clutching gilded invitations, the distant clatter of ivory tokens falling onto mosaic floors, all became part of a dreadful ritual. Caligula's vision of Rome was no mere tyranny. It was a dystopian rebirth, orchestrated by ledgers and laboratories, by architects and apothecaries, by priests and guards, and in the hush of dawn, when the city still slumbered under the weight of its own complicity, the palace stood vast and silent, its walls awash with memory and dread, for within its corridors, every flicker of torchlight bore witness to a transformation far more profound than political upheaval. It was the metamorphosis of an empire's soul, reduced to a ledger entry, one more line in an endless catalogue of trapped bodies and shattered families. In that muted stillness, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the moment when even the flicker of hope would be consumed by Caligula's darkest design. The dark ledger recorded every moment with solemn precision, each subject's age, their compliance level, even the estimated revenue garnered from leasing sexual servants. Some marginal notes recommended increasing supply ahead of major festivals to maximize profit, while certain pages bore the seal imperial secret, accessible only to the chief advisor and Helon. In those ink-black margins, human lives were weighed and measured like grain, each entry a quiet testament to suffering catalogued for calculation rather than compassion. Yet these bureaucratic horrors did not remain confined to hidden rooms. Caligula devised what was chillingly dubbed the torch ritual, mandating that high-ranking lawmakers stand along a 10-foot corridor, each clutching a torch at a precisely calculated height. Through a narrow crack in an iron door, the torchlight would bore into a chamber of torment, where the accused, often one's own daughter or wife, endured unspeakable agony. To look away or falter in one's grip was to incur the ultimate penalty, death for oneself, and instant inclusion of the faltering senator's loved one in the pleasure ledger's next grim round. Those who later came forward to describe the scene spoke in hushed, haunted tones. They recalled the moment the heavy door swung open, the darkness inside, lit by harsh torchlight, and the sound of stifled sobs and panicked wails crashing against the stone walls. Each shriek echoed like a funeral knell through the marble corridor, sobering every man into rigid silence. Fathers once esteemed for leading legions now stood powerless, holding their torches in trembling hands, their final belief in the sanctity of family dissolving before their eyes in a storm of terror. Outside the palace, the common folk caught wind of these dreadful rites and exchanged whispered warnings in the black market taverns and narrow alleyways. Yet no one dared to speak openly. Any cry of protest was met with swift disappearance. No body, no whisper, as though the very accused had been erased from existence. Thus Rome became a city of silent memory, where honor was bartered in the shadows, and the only testament to defiance lay in the desperate graffiti scrawled on crumbling walls. "We are the damned who walk. May the gods forgive those compelled." This abominable machinery grew ever more refined. Whispers of dissent within the guard or the Senate were quietly extinguished. Some men were executed without announcement. Others dragged into secluded chambers to be retrained through psychological torment. The pleasure ledger itself became a tool of intimidation, its leather-bound volumes brandished before trembling spectators as proof of every official's complicity. To resist meant an entry under recalcitrant, a notation that brought families to ruin and ensured perpetual silence. And so the empire, once celebrated for its law and order, transformed into a seamless network of oppression. Every interaction governed by fear, encoded into meticulous list and ledger, each torchlit corridor, each echo of a suppressed cry, reinforced the message in Caligula's Rome. No sanctuary remained. As the city drifted into uneasy slumber each night, its citizens dreamed not of freedom but of dark ledgers and torchlight, knowing that tomorrow's dawn would bring another page in the endless chronicle of sorrow. Inside the imperial harem, Caligula extended his dominion through ceremonies, cloaked in religious veneer. He commissioned the construction of what he called the Temple of Divine Therapy, a structure whose outer walls exhaled incense clouds, and whose inner chambers functioned as a grim factory of suffering. Members of the court, high-ranking officials, and foreign envoys were summoned to attend these unholy rites. Noble women, prized for their lineage and beauty, were bound atop stone altars, their wrists secured by gilded chains, as if they were offerings to a god they did not worship. Each ceremony unfolded under the watchful gaze of clad priests, who proclaimed the acts as sacred, transforming cruelty into divine service. These rituals followed a meticulously scripted choreography. Participants donned sumptuous ceremonial robes, their fabrics whispering against polished marble floors. The women, escorted in silken veils, assumed prescribed postures, arms raised, eyes cast upward, while a chorus of priests intoned prayers in measured cadence. A hush fell as musicians struck chords on lyres, the mournful notes underscoring the gravity of the spectacle. At the climactic moment, the lead priest, garbed in embroidered vestments, chanted invocations, prompting the assembled lords to applaud in solemn recognition. Scribes perched at elevated desks recorded each detail in the pleasure ledger, the victim's name, the precise service category, and the signature of a senior magistrate attesting to its imperial authorization. Caligula's reach extended beyond palace walls in a formal decree that all citizens deliver offerings and chant prayers for divine fertility. Markets and piazzas filled with makeshift altars where crusts of bread and clusters of grapes were laid at the feet of statues. Town criers instructed the populace in exact liturgies, and those who failed to participate faced denunciation as traitors to the emperor's exaltation. This state-sponsored faith masked the truth of courtly atrocities, converting every spectator into a spiritual partner in the crime. Under this contrived religion, denial of the ceremonies equated to sacrilege, ensuring unspoken complicity across every stratum of society. Within the palace walls, the harrowing outcomes of the royal stock-breeding initiative seeped into everyday bureaucracy. Children born from these arranged unions were subject to rigorous classification a moment after their first breaths. Boys demonstrating robust health and stature were dispatched to the military academies, drilled in formation and obedience. Adolescent girls deemed aesthetically pleasing entered the divine handmaiden training, learning ritual dances and hymns for future festival duties. Those who did not meet imperial standards were relegated to forced labor in the palace workshops, outfitted like beasts of burden. Regular medical inspections charted growth and vitality. Each child's performance index logged in reports that determined their ultimate fate. Aparayil program, known as feminization training, introduced another layer of cruelty. Young sons of high-born families were led into the palace's north wing, a labyrinth of full-length mirrors and perfumed anterooms. There, attendants daubed their cheeks with powder and brushed their hair into elaborate styles. Lessons in speech modulation taught them to adopt lilting, demure tones, while choreographers instructed them in graceful hand gestures and measured walks befitting a temple priestess. Each boy's original name was struck from court records, replaced by one drawn from blooms. Flora, Lily, rose symbols of beauty and fragility. Daily performance evaluations assessed their compliance, adaptability, and presentational skill, with charts recording every nuance of expression. All of these chapters of human misery were consolidated into the palace's secret archives. Velvet-covered cases held volumes stamped strictly confidential, ensuring that Caligula possessed indisputable proof of every noble's involvement, whether as benefactor, victim, or witness. Each document served as both ledger and leverage, enabling the emperor to tighten his grip at will. No senator, no consul, no envoy could claim ignorance. To open a volume was to confront one's own signature at the foot of the page. The archives stood as silent guardians of terror, their bound pages a testament to a regime that had recalibrated power around the commodification of flesh and the sanctification of brutality. In this slow, grinding turn of the wheel, Rome's Grand Palace ceased to be a symbol of imperial majesty and became, instead, a monument to administrative atrocity. The careful architecture, once aimed at exalting civic pride, now served to magnify the tiniest whimper into a chorus of dread. Statues of triumphant emperors were shadowed by the knowledge that each polished surface concealed a ledger, entry, a name, a date, a humiliation. As the city slumbered under torchlit skies, its sleep was haunted by the spectre of those secret volumes. Each page a silent accusation that no light, however bright, could ever fully dispel. Beyond the palace walls, Caligula's cruel design unfurled like a dark banner across the empire. He extended his marketing of suffering network to every province, inviting envoys from neighboring realms to witness staged morality enhancement ceremonies, carefully curated glimpses of the horrors performed in private. These dignitaries sat on gilded benches, applauded in solemn accord, and diligently recorded every detail before returning to their home courts with tales of Rome's terrifying dynastic transformation. Such invitations lent a veneer of diplomatic grandeur to what were, in truth, mere appetizers for the emperor's appetite for agony. In distant territory, where once proud noble families governed largely in peace, secret edicts now mandated their participation in the imperial spectacle. Any household that failed to supply sexual servants or to submit the prescribed reports by the appointed hour was branded a traitor, its estates confiscated and, in some cases, its members executed without public trial. To enforce this, Caligula deployed a web of covert agents, shadowy figures who appeared suddenly at midnight, extracted whispered confessions, then vanished like mist. Meanwhile, palace clerks and tax collectors travelled under the guise of census-taking, coaxing families into the so-called national program with promises of honorary titles and proximity to imperial favour, promises that in fact bound them irrevocably to complicity. This insidious campaign deepened Rome's social divide. Supporters of the emperor, intoxicated by the promise of renewed greatness and flush with gifts from the palace, hailed these new rights as the hallmark of just order. Yet the majority of citizens, mortified by rumours and half-heard accounts, sank into silence, guarding their fears behind locked doors. No district remained untouched by the hush that fell like ash over fields and city streets. Attempts to flee the emperor's gaze proved futile, for the secret police trailed caravans, even across mountain passes. Faced with the choice of defiance or survival, most bowed their heads, finding in their own quiet capitulation the only sanctuary left. Century later, archaeologists unearthed fragments of the pleasure ledger in charred corners of the palace archives. Though many pages had succumbed to fire and time, enough remained to reveal the system's ghastly sophistication. Sections labelled Resource Assessment, Special Category, and top-secret notes hinted at the cold calculus that governed human life. Scholars studying these ash-stained leaves concluded that this was no impromptu reign of terror, but a fully mechanized state apparatus designed to institutionalize sexual violence and torture. Each ledger page, with its neat columns and margin annotations marveling at efficiency gains, testified to a bureaucracy that valued human suffering as a resource to be optimized through this monstrous bureaucracy. Caligula demonstrated the terrifying synergy of absolute power and administrative order. His edicts, framed in majestic legal language and sealed with the imperial signet, transformed atrocity into routine governance, making rebellion seem as distant as a forgotten dream. The dark volumes of the palace ledgers, their bindings still sealed when found, stand today as the ultimate testament to an emperor who blurred the line between law and cruelty in their cracked and burned pages. One reads the empire's most dreadful chronicle, a record of how easily civilization's machinery can be repurposed to serve the cruelest of designs, and how an entire society can be led, step by silent step, into complicity with the darkest impulses of a single man. After the pleasure ledger system spread its sinister reach across the empire, a portion of its most harrowing entries came to light, revealing the true horror of Caligula's design. These catalogues did far more than record the dates when a victim was engaged. Each entry meticulously noted a compliance rating, a group classification, and, in some cases, a special category designation. Terms like female senatorial class, restricted assignment, or item 247 stood alongside cryptic abbreviations that sent chills through any who dared glance at them. The black ink on pale parchment spoke not only in figures, but in the silent screams of countless souls whose suffering had been bureaucratized. Within the silent corridors of the imperial palace, senators who once strode confidently through the forum now moved in hushed dread. The flicker of torchlight along the marble walls revealed tension etched into their faces. They understood all too well that a single question, whether about the grain levy or the security of a frontier province, might be construed as dissent. Such an utterance would instantly consign a senator's wife or daughter to the ledger, summoning her into the emperor's private chambers for an irrevocable fate. In Rome's grand tradition of free speech, that liberty had vanished, replaced by the constant, unspoken terror of ledger lines. And it was not only senators' kin who found themselves reduced to ledger entries. Merchant families, equestrian nobles, and even the city's respected magistrates discovered their children assessed alongside courtesans and gladiators. Those ranked as low-yield resources faced stark choices: submit to repeated productivity evaluations or be designated non-viable asset, a euphemism for exile to remote provinces or chains in forced labor camps. The emperor's economy of agony ensured a constant churn of human bodies, each one a commodity slated for either further spectacle or silent erasure. In the earliest days, these dreadful records were locked away within the palace's most secure vaults, accessible only to a handful of inner court officials and, of course, Helen himself. Yet as whispers spread, a few of the darker pages slipped beyond the golden portals. Marketplaces and taverns became conduits for rumor. As rogue copies circulated among merchants and wayfarers, rumors told of illustrations depicting each stage of the ceremonies. Charred edges, still bearing scorch marks from hurried concealment. Even more unsettling were the so-called survival rate reports, statistical breakdowns that reduced the endurance of each entry to a percentage. Those unfortunate enough to land in the experimental category knew well that the odds were grim, so grim that few ever returned to tell the tale. Despite these ominous leaks, public panic never coalesced into outright revolt. Every secret meeting of the Senate was shadowed by covert observers, ensuring that any spark of resistance was extinguished before it could flare. Disappearances were swift and silent. One moment, a vocal dissenter might be present, and the next, a ledger entry would mark her as processed. The enforced quietude of Rome's elite only served to legitimize Caligula's terror as legitimate policy. What began as unspeakable horror had been recast as a sweeping administrative program, virtually untouchable by the usual checks and balances of the Republic. It was only centuries later, when archaeologists unearthed bits of charred parchment in the ruins of the imperial archives, that the full scale of the pleasure ledger emerged from the shadows. Fragments bore the same imperial seal as grain quotas and diplomatic correspondence, evidence that the acts of cruelty had been as central to Caligula's bureaucracy as any civic duty. Though many pages had succumbed to fire and damp, those that survived left no doubt here lay the shell of the empire's most ruthless administrative engine. Names, ages, and ledger codes still visible among the stains. Alongside marginal notes on the economic yield of each service package, an unimaginable merging of commerce and cruelty. These tobacco-brown leaves, brittle as old bones, stand now as Rome's darkest legacy. They reveal how an empire, guided by law and reason, can be twisted into a vehicle of systemic atrocity when power is left unchecked and humanity is reduced to columns of ink. As scholars pieced together the narrative, they found that Caligula's greatest triumph was the seamless fusion of terror with governance, a nightmare made permanent by statute and signature. And so, in the hush of modern libraries, the pleasure ledger rests an enduring testament to the most dreadful chapter of Roman history, where every line written in black ink memorialized a human life, transformed into a mere footnote of suffering. Not content with his sinister ledgers, Caligula resolved to shatter the empire's last taboo. He decreed a flamboyant ceremony called the Solemn Veneration of Kin, to be held in the grand hall of the palace. 300 guests packed the marble galleries, senators, high priests, and ambassadors from foreign courts, all draped in their finest silks and togas. The air glowed with torchlight and perfumed smoke as the emperor himself took center stage, in a moment that stunned every witness. He knelt before his sister Drusilla, grasped her hand, and proclaimed that Jupiter had bestowed upon her a divine blessing, making her his rightful consort. The spectacle was a grotesque desecration of faith. Caligula invoked the mythic marriage of Jupiter and Juno, weaving it into his own incestuous union with Drusilla, and by doing so recast a sacred legend as an imperial decree. Priests assisted in choreographing the scene, chanting scripted hymns and urging the assembly to applaud this hallowed alliance. No one dared withhold their approval. To turn away from the cup raised in toast or to avert one's gaze was to risk being labelled a traitor to the emperor's exaltation. A verdict that carried swift and terrible consequences. Rumours of an inappropriate closeness between Caligula and Drusilla had drifted through palace corridors and marketplace gossip, but no one had spoken them aloud. After the ceremony, those rumours solidified into unambiguous truth. Drusilla, the sole companion permitted to tend Caligula during his near-fatal illness, was now enshrined as a living goddess. Under the guise of being his wife and sister, her very existence twisted into the apparatus of state worship. Giulia Lilla, the younger sister, initially resisted. She slipped away from the banquet, attempting to preserve what shred of dignity she could. But the full might of the imperial household descended upon her. Court functionaries seized hair, draping her in ceremonial robes and subjecting her to a fabricated prophecy of divine mission. She was escorted into the palace's secluded wing, barred from any contact save with the emperor himself. Her anguish and humiliation became tools in Caligula's display of power by subjugating even his own blood. He demonstrated that no bond, however sacred, could stand against his will. Over the following 2 months, Caligula transformed the palace into a stage for the ongoing display of his divine siblings. Drusilla and Giulia Lilla were paraded before audiences at every public council meeting, seated side by side with the emperor, in a manner that equated their status with that of his official wives and concubines. Artists and scribes were tasked with rendering portraits and sketches of these appearances, later sealed as confidential drafts in the imperial archives. Thus did an act of private depravity become a matter of public record, inscribed as state policy rather than scandalous secret. Incest ceased to be whispered gossip. It became a national program. To Caligula, this ultimate taboo was merely another ritual to assert dominance. By elevating Drusilla to the rank of consort and Giulia Lilla to the role of ritual attendant, he rewrote every existing law against consanguinity. the old mores of Rome, which had drawn clear lines between public duty and private vice, crumbled beneath the force of his will. In the hushed awe of his subjects, the emperor's madness was sanctified. This solemn veneration reached its climax in a final decree. All temples across the empire were ordered to celebrate a day of thanksgiving for the divine sibling hierarchy. Statues of Drusilla adorned public squares, and prayers to Sister Queen Drusilla replaced those to Juno in many households. The memory of the rite, once an act of unspeakable horror, was reframed as a cornerstone of the state religion. To refuse participation was no longer a private sin. It was an act of treason against the empire itself. In this way, Caligula's moral collapse achieved its apex. No longer merely a tyrant indulging personal vice, he had engineered a system that coerced every citizen into consecrating his transgressions as divine will. Ethics and family bonds, once regarded as the pillars of Roman society, lay in shattered stones along the palace forecourt, trampled beneath the flickering torches that lit his path to madness. And so, as the months wore on, the empire of Caligula found itself ruled not by law, nor by tradition, nor by virtue, but by the twisted reenactment of a god's forbidden union. The halls that once echoed with debates over justice and governance now resounded with chants in honor of a sibling pair, whose very relationship encapsulated the depth of Rome's descent. In the annals of history, this ceremony would stand as the final, most chilling testament to how absolute power in tandem with ritual and administration could pervert the sacred and render the unthinkable into the everyday. At the end of June in 38 AD, Drusilla suddenly passed away under mysterious circumstances. Rumours fluttered through the palace corridors and crowded marketplaces alike. Some whispered of a fatal complication during childbirth, while others wove darker tales of poison administered by hands weary of endless humiliation. No official cause was ever disclosed, and her death dealt the final, devastating blow to any remnants of humanity left in Caligula's reign. In public grief, the emperor ascended the dais of the main hall, his features contorted by raw sorrow, and he placed her lifeless form upon the golden throne. With tears that seemed both genuine and performative, he issued an edict to deify her henceforth as goddess Drusilla. Across the city, grand temples rose overnight in Drusilla's honor. Their exteriors belched incense into the dawn sky, while inside, priests garbed in violet and gold presided over relentless ceremonies. Citizens were compelled to offer tribute loaves of barley bread, amphorae of red wine, and, most chillingly, bound slaves as sacrificial gifts. Attendance records for each ritual were meticulously maintained, the names of supplicants, the nature and quantity of offerings, and even the prayer formulae prescribed by the imperial council. What was lauded as a celebration of divinity served in truth as mass psychological torture, transforming collective mourning into a mechanism of control. Julia Lilla and Agrena, Drusilla's younger sister and third sister, respectively, received no solace, despite their new titles as Drusilla's co-goddesses. Dressed in funeral, blacks trimmed with purple, they were forced to reenact the stages of Drusilla's demise in alternate rituals. First, they relived the divine wedding, draped in ceremonial robes, and bound at the wrist in imitation of the original ceremony. Then they enacted the consecration feast, where they were seated at a high table, their heads bowed under wreaths of laurel and myrtle. The chamber echoed with dirge-like music, its mournful melody mingling with the whispered praise of officials compelled to kneel before Drusilla's statue and recite hymns of adoration. To publicly subject the young princesses to this spectacle ensured their shame would never fade. They were instructed to swallow their tears and suppress any sign of resistance. A single tremor in the voice, a hitch in the breath, or a stray tear was enough to brand them blasphemers against the emperor's household. Anyone daring to murmur dissent, no matter how faint, would be deemed guilty of sacrilege, and their family's name would be added to the pleasure ledger in the next round of processing Under this cruel calculus, even the act of breathing freely became an act of protest, punishable by horrors, yet recorded in cold ink. In the months that followed, the palace's shadow grew darker still. The city's moral foundations, once grounded in piety and familial loyalty, crumbled beneath the weight of state-sanctioned defilement. Parents whispered warnings to their children, urging them to stay indoors and keep their prayers silent. The once familiar rhythms of daily life, market bargains, school lesson, evening strolls were drowned out by the ever-increasing demands of worshipping a goddess who had died a mortal death. No pamphlet of scripture offered guidance. Instead, imperial shards of prophecy left citizens uncertain whether to raise their hands in praise or hide them in terror. The scale of Caligula's atrocity, marked by Drusilla's death and the abominable funeral rites, signified a turning point in the empire's decline. No longer could one claim ignorance of the regime's depravity. The line between sanctity and horror had been erased, replaced by an apparatus that reduced every act of faith to an act of complicity. Those who once upheld Rome's traditions, magistrates, priests, and patricians, now enforced rituals that stripped them of conscience, turning them into automatons in a theatre of suffering. As the summer wore on, the city's true wound became apparent, not a wound inflicted by foreign armies, but one carved deep within the hearts of Roman families. When fathers escorted their daughters to the shrine of Drusilla, they too were bound by fear. Their love twisted into an obligation to participate in sacrilege. Mothers, clutching younger children, could only pray that innocence might somehow survive in the shadows. And children, taught from birth to revere an emperor as divine, grew up believing that worship required witnessing what no soul should ever see. In time, the grand statues of Drusilla, once placed in forums and squares, were draped in purple veils to hide their own horror. Yet even covered, they stood as silent reminders of a people who had surrendered their dignity, convinced that by bowing before a false divinity, they would spare themselves from the ledger's next page. And so, under torchlit nights and incense-laden skies, Rome moved forward into its darkest epoch, its moral compass shattered by a festival of tears that never ceased, orchestrated by an emperor who had turned grief into a weapon and deified cruelty as the highest sacrifice. After Drusilla's solemn funeral rites, Caligula showed no sign of relenting. Instead, he pressed forward to expand his temple of sacred service, a fusion of medicine, religion, and unspeakable cruelty. The eastern wing of the palace was transformed into a gilded sanctuary, its entrance flanked by columns wrapped in gold leaf. Statues of gods hung thick with incense, and palace musicians playing liturgical hymns that echoed through marble halls. Yet behind these sumptuous facades lay a refrigerator of suffering, where sexual slavery and torture were euphemistically labeled divine services. Attendance at each ceremony was mandatory for the wives of high officials, who were summoned as sacrificial offerings. Arrayed in ceremonial garments, flowing robes of deep purple trimmed with silver, they passed through satin-draped vestibules and proffered their wrists for inspection before entering the private chambers. There, physicians trained in Alexandria's famed schools, once healers of war-wounded legions, measured hip girth, recorded fertility histories, and prescribed diets intended to optimize reproductive yield. Every data point, blood pressure, menstrual cycle, weight fluctuations was dutifully logged in leather-bound ledgers, feeding the empire's drive to perfect the royal bloodstock. But women were not the empire's sole resources. Young noblemen, too, were ensnared by this sprawling industry of bondage. They were led into the mirror chamber, its walls lined with polished bronze, reflecting faint torchlight. There, female attendants anointed them with scented oils, styled their hair into elaborate curls, and dressed them in diaphanous silks that accentuated delicate features. Training followed lessons in graceful movement, soft vocal exercices, and choreographed gestures meant to evoke the gentle grace of the temple priestesses. At the end of the process, each boy's birth name was struck from the court records. In its place, they received floral titles: Flora, Lily, Rose to mark their transformation, their individual dossiers stored in the inner archives, detailed vocal suppleness, dance proficiency, and obedience quotient, ensuring every aspect of their performance was scientifically monitored. Caligula also introduced what his courtiers called the white jade token system, a small medallion engraved with a chamber number, date, and hour. Recipients, typically senators or senior magistrates, were compelled to attend specified rites at the exact moment indicated. Failure to present oneself at the appointed time meant the token was revoked, stripping one's family of administrative privileges and branding them as potential rebels. The token served as both invitation and indictment, a shimmering reminder that even the highest families were beholden to the emperor's will. Through this seamless integration of medical oversight, bureaucratic rigor, and engineered spirituality, Caligula turned acts of depravity into something legitimate. Palace-trained priests led invocations, chanting formulaic benedictions that purported to cleanse participants of sin. They waved censers of burning incense in measured patterns, as though performing a sacred ablution, all while affirming the morality of the emperor's actions. Meanwhile, the court registers kept exact records of each token distributed, each attendee's arrival and departure, and most importantly, each measure of emperor satisfaction, scored on a scale that ranged from adequate to exemplary. Rome, once heralded as the globe's pinnacle of civilization, had become a meticulously organized sorrow depot, where every human life was catalogued and rationed according to priority tiers. The currency of honor, once measured in deeds of valor or acts of statesmanship, was now quantified in ledger entries. One's very existence, family lineage, marital bonds, corporeal integrity was subject to the same exacting standards used by grain merchants and tax collectors. A single stamp of the imperial seal on a document could condemn an entire household to suffering or grant it the rarest privileges. In the hush of early evening, as the city's throngs drifted home beneath lantern light, the palace corridors thrummed with whispered echoes of ordinances and schedules. Servants passed secret memos, detailing the next week's roster of services, while guards posted notices of token deadlines on varnished oak doors. Even those living in distant provinces felt the pulse of Caligula's system, the white jade token. Once rumoured to exist only in the eastern wing, began appearing in provincial edicts, summoning local dignitaries to imperial audiences that doubled as assessments of troop morale, grain supply, and, most horrifyingly, human resources. Thus, by fusing civic administration with sacramental spectacle, Caligula ensured that cruelty advanced under the respectable guises of progress and piety. No decree was too small to escape registration, no whim too lurid to be inscribed in court records. Even the most private moments were harvested for state gain. In this way, an emperor who once promised to return to gentler days instead shattered every boundary, forging a system of terror so comprehensive that it rendered every citizen complicit, whether by active participation or silent consent. As night settled on the eternal city, the palace's golden gates stood silent, guarding corridors that resonated with the hush of forced obedience. Within, the Temple of Sacred Service prepared for its next cycle of evaluations, a new generation of candidates, a fresh array of white jade tokens, and the unending scorecards of suffering. In such a realm, true power lay not in sword or senate decree, but in the quiet certainty that every heart beat beneath the emperor's watchful eye, and that no ledger, no matter how dark, could ever capture the full depth of Rome's descent into that final, abyssal night. The final imprint of Caligula's reign was not carved into stone by conquering legions, but etched in ink across ledger pages and preserved in the hushed corridors of a forgotten vault. Though the emperor fell to the blades of the Praetorian Guard in 41 AD, the dreadful framework he constructed endured. Leather-bound volumes lay abandoned on dusty shelves, their spines cracked, but their contents intact. Maps charting the distribution of human resources, lists of white jade tokens with precise issuing dates, and meticulous reports detailing each family's reproductive assessment, long after the bloodstains on the marble floors had been scrubbed away. The torch stands remained anchored to the walls, rusted yet unwavering in their predetermined positions, silent sentinels to crimes unspoken. Century later, archaeologists uncovered these relics beneath layers of debris. The cherubic faces of carved angels flanking the corridors belied the twisted purpose of the space. Researchers found that the torch stands were affixed with millimeter precision, ensuring that flame light would slice through narrow slits into inner chambers where the most private torments were enacted. Fragments of brittle papyrus, charred at the edges, bore scrawled annotations directives to increase supply ahead of the Saturnalia festival, and notes prioritizing tokens for wealthy patrician families. Each scrap, painstakingly reassembled, testified to a system that had industrialized human misery, transforming atrocity into a quantifiable resource. Yet the empire's dark legacy did not rest only in silent artifacts. It lingered in the collective memory of those who studied its remnants. Caligula himself became a figure of mythic terror, part tyrant, part debauched wildman, his name uttered with a mix of fascination and revulsion. Scholars posited that without the vast apparatus of clerks, secretaries, and ledger keepers, without the administrative machinery that recorded every transaction, every body processed, Caligula could never have sustained his reign of terror. It was bureaucracy, they concluded, that transformed unchecked power into endless violence, embedding atrocity within the very fabric of governance. Rome, once lauded as the cradle of law and order, now bore an indelible scar beneath its imperial veneer. The empire's chronicles, which had celebrated triumphs and tributes, were now tinged with an unspoken counter-narrative, a chronicle of dehumanization rendered in columns of dates and codes. The state's mechanisms, tax collectors, archivists, council decrees had been repurposed to facilitate horrors unthinkable in any previous era. What had been the hallmark of civilization organization? Record-keeping. Legal codes became the engine of cruelty, proving that the tools of governance could just as easily catalogue suffering as distribute grain. In the quiet halls of modern archives, historians pore over fragments of Caligula's pleasure ledger and token rolls, tracing the outlines of a system that remained astonishing in its precision. They speak of an empire that had slipped the shackles of moral restraint, allowing the machinery of administration to justify any command, no matter how perverse. The ledger entries they observe serve as both indictment and epitaph, a reminder that when power is wielded without limit, and when the rituals of state replace the dictates of conscience, humanity itself becomes an expendable statistic. Today, when we recount the story of Caligula, it is not solely as a tale of jealous madness or personal depravity. Rather, we remember the ledger's black ink and the torch stand's cold metal as the true symbols of his reign. They warn us that the most terrible innovations are not those of sword and siege, but of formality and file, when the instruments of bureaucracy are turned to evil ends. The line between administration and atrocity vanishes. And so, in the echoes of Rome's great chronicles, and in the brittle leaves of its secret ledgers, we find the empire's darkest lesson, that the fusion of limitless power with unblinking record-keeping can forever blur the boundary between justice and cruelty. And so, when the curtain of history falls upon the dark pages of Caligula's reign, we shudder not only at the emperor's personal brutality, but also recognize a profound lesson about the power of a corrupted bureaucracy. This story demonstrates that absolute authority, if not restrained by ethical principles, the rule of law, and rigorous oversight, can transform even the most civilized society into a factory of suffering, where agony is monitored, scheduled, and tallied as though it were a commercial product. The greatest message for the viewer is this: the separation between right and wrong is not self-evident, but rather the achievement of a balanced system of checks and controls. When lust for power and private desire merge with bureaucratic procedure, no gap remains between legal authority and criminal atrocity. Any individual may become a victim if that system operates under the maxim of profiting from pain. Through this video, we learn that history does not merely record battles and heroic triumphs, but also chronicles the darkest moments of civilization when atrocity is legalized by decree, when fear becomes an instrument of governance, and when the machinery of administration reduces human beings to mere data points. It warns us of the latent danger in any organization or institution if power goes unchecked, and if those holding the administrative keys forget their duty to conscience. The result will be a comprehensive moral decay of society. Moreover, this narrative reminds each of us of our personal and collective responsibility to monitor, speak out against, and halt injustice. Silence is not always the safe choice. Sometimes it is the very means by which ethical collapse is facilitated. Only by upholding our shared humanity, placing the value of human life above every bureaucratic procedure, and safeguarding the faintest cry for help, can we prevent the numbers in the ledger from becoming the sole measure of human worth. Therefore, when you finish watching and the lights grow dim, remember that Caligula's story is more than a tale of past tyranny. It is a vivid lesson in how we build or break civilization. In reading each blackened page of that imperial ledger, we are called to vigilance against the abuse of power and to cherish the moral values that define our humanity.